Today we're going to talk about Watergate. Now, what you have to understand is Watergate is not a single act. The break-in of the National Democratic headquarters, the Watergate building, was just the tip of the iceberg. It is what investigators found that occurred at the same time that becomes what we call Watergate today. In June of 1972, before the Democrats had met to nominate McGovern, before the Republicans had met in Miami to nominate Nixon, the National Democratic headquarters in the Watergate building, which is on the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., was broken into. When these 5 men were arrested, it was discovered by the police that all 5 of these men had worked for the CIA, that all of them had a large amount of cash on them, and that one of them had a book that contained various phone numbers, one of the numbers being the White House number with the initials CC in it. 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward, who is on the right, and Carl Bernstein, who is on the left, were assigned to investigate the case. Woodward and Bernstein were reporters who looked into crime. They weren't political reporters, they were crime reporters. And they were reporters who dealt mostly with crime in the Washington, D.C. area. Woodward and Bernstein, as they wrote the stories, would be helped by a variety of sources. One was a White House source, which Woodward referred to always simply as Deep Throat. Deep Throat was a pornographic film that had come out in 1972, and the person that Woodward spoke to, Deep Throat, was giving incredibly damaging information not only about Watergate, but about the Nixon administration itself. Deep Throat constantly reminded Woodward that the secret to unraveling Watergate and all the other things that were happening was to follow the money. Now, at the time, the Republican Party to re-elect the president, or CREEP, C-R-E-P, Committee to re-elect the president, was run by this gentleman right here, John Mitchell. John Mitchell is the one who's just coming out of the door. John Mitchell was also the Attorney General. So in a sense, Richard Nixon is going to go to the Attorney General and the FBI to investigate Richard Nixon. In time, the reporters, not only from the Washington Post, but other news media, were able to trace the money from CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, back to the White House. Now, this gentleman here is G. Gordon Liddy. G. Gordon Liddy was a member of what President Nixon called the plumbers. The plumbers were people who were in the White House who were assigned to first find leaks in the White House, who in the White House was leaking information to the press. Now, Liddy had been on the job ever since the Pentagon Papers. And Liddy and some of his friends had been given other tasks by the president. These other tasks are going to lead to further investigations of Watergate. By the spring of 1973, the 5 burglars are all indicted for the crime and are about ready to go on trial. The burglars are asked to cut a deal, and in the deal they implicate various White House officials in the break-in. Now, the trial itself fell under the domain of this gentleman here, Judge John Sirica. Judge John Sirica is going to empower a grand jury. And in this grand jury, various people accused of crimes will be allowed to tell their story, and their crimes will be reduced, or they will be given amnesty if their feelings are made to be found true. Now, the U.S. House, which is heavily Democratic, is not a big fan of Nixon, and they are going to appoint this man, Archibald Cox. So we basically have two investigations going on at the same time officially. We have Archibald Cox and the Watergate Special Investigative Committee for the U.S. House, and we have Judge John Sirica and his grand jury. In addition to this, we have the Washington Post, we have the New York Times, we have CBS, NBC, ABC, all are looking into the Nixon White House. In the summer of 1973, President Nixon is going to ask Archibald Cox to back down. Archibald Cox refuses, and Nixon is going to fire Mr. Cox. Now, in those days, the way the special prosecutor worked, the special prosecutor, a group of names would be given to the president by the House, and the president would pick one. Nixon had picked Cox, but Cox had become too aggressive, according to Richard Nixon, and Nixon ordered his attorney general to fire Archibald Cox. The Attorney General of the United States refused and quit out in protest. The Assistant Attorney General was told to fire Cox, and the Assistant Attorney General said no, and he was fired. Finally, the Solicitor General, the person who goes before the Supreme Court and argues cases, was asked to fire Archibald Cox, and the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, agreed. This episode in American history became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
The events that followed became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Because of the president's action, the attorney general has resigned. Elliot Richardson has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Ruckelshaus refused, in a moment of constitutional drama, to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor. And half an hour after the special Watergate prosecutor had been fired, agents of the FBI, acting at the direction of the White House, sealed off the offices of the special prosecutor, the offices of the Attorney General, and the offices of the Deputy Attorney General.
6 FBI agents present, impeding our operations right now.
All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis in which the president has set himself against his own Attorney General and the Department of Justice. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
More than 50,000 telegrams poured in on Capitol Hill today. So many, Western Union was swamped. Most of them demanded impeaching Mr. Nixon.
These come from Republicans and businessmen and people, most of whom begin their statement by saying, I've supported the president, I've never believed in impeachment, but he's now gone too far, and we want the Congress to take strong action.
In my 3 district offices in the 1 Republican area, my phone calls were 100 to 1 in favor of pursuing the path of impeachment, which was rather shocking to me.
I was terribly surprised, which says something about that very weird thing that happens when you're in the middle of a cocoon of a crisis within a protected environment, and you have a great desire for things to happen as you want them to happen.
On Tuesday, Nixon learned that 21 resolutions calling for his impeachment had been introduced on Capitol Hill. Stunned by the ferocity of the public reaction, Nixon retreated. He appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and agreed to release the 9 subpoenaed tapes.
Now, we heard the name of Leon Jaworski. Leon Jaworski was a Texas lawyer who had worked mostly in organized crime. Now, we also heard in the short video about the tapes. The tapes are going to become more important as we go through the rest of this lesson. In 1973, the House has its investigation going. John Sirica has his investigation going. And the U.S. Senate is going to begin an investigation of its own. Now, it is during the Senate investigation that some low-ranking White House officials are asked to come and testify. One of them is Alexander Butterfield. And during his testimony, Butterfield is asked a question, and Butterfield is going to say, well, you know, why don't you listen to the tapes? Well, the senator said, what tapes? And Butterfield had said that President Nixon had recorded all of the conversations on the phone in his office and all of the conversations that he had had in his Oval Office, so that years later, as he began to write his memoirs, he would be able to quote directly from the tapes. The Senate felt it must listen to these tapes. Archibald Cox had subpoenaed several tapes. These are the tapes that eventually got Cox fired, and these are the tapes that Nixon said he would release. Eventually, high-ranking White House officials will come forward. One was White House counsel John Dean. Now, John Dean was the personal lawyer for the president, not Richard Nixon, but the personal lawyer for the president. If the president wants to ask a question, Dean would answer it. If Richard Nixon, a defendant, wanted to answer the question, Dean said he could not. Dean said that there was a cover-up going on in the White House, that there was much more to Watergate than this simple break-in. And the Senate began to investigate even farther. Dean had stated that the White House had manipulated the 72 elections so that all the good Democrats were not able to get the nomination, and that the easiest Democrat for Nixon to defeat was given the nomination. All the other White House officials said that Dean was wrong. Dean was fired from his post by the president, but the Senate continued to dig. Dean had spoke of dirty tricks that the Nixon administration had used. Now, for our purposes, we're going to call them dirty tricks, because on the tapes, Richard Nixon had a more, shall we say, colorful name for them, which involved a rodent and a term that starts with the letter F and would get you into a lot of trouble here at Helias High School if you were to say it. The Senate called upon the courts to order President Nixon to release the tapes. Nixon said no. Nixon invoked executive privilege. Now, the president never wants to lose power to another branch of government. So if, say, the legislative branch is asking for the executive branch to do something to lose power, and the president doesn't want to, he invokes executive privilege. Now, Nixon said that these tapes would show the president in a bad light and refused to release them. Sorry about that, I'm having some problems. Richard Nixon came up with a compromise. He would allow certain Southern Democrats to listen to the tapes. The Southern Democrats would then write down their recollection of what they heard. The Senate said no. In 1974, the Watergate 7, these were the 5 burglars plus 2 people from the White House, were convicted of the crimes and were indicted by the grand jury. There was an 8th person indicted who was an unindicted co-conspirator. In other words, he was involved in it but could not be indicted at this time. This, of course, was Richard Nixon. In time, the federal court will indict high-ranking White House officials. John Ehrlichman, who had run the plumbers unit, H.R. Haldeman, who was chief of staff, Chuck Colson, who was responsible for many of the break-ins. All of them would eventually serve time. We'll hear more about these individuals in just a couple of moments.
'72 was a very busy year for me. It was a year when we had the visit to China. It was a year when we had the visit to Moscow. And then in December, of course, perhaps the most difficult decision I made of the December bombing, which did lead to the uneasy peace, but it is peace with all the Americans home, all of our POWs home. Now, during that period of time, frankly, I didn't manage the campaign. I didn't run the campaign. People around me didn't bring things to me that they probably should have, because I was frankly just too busy trying to do the nation's business to run the politics. If mistakes are made, however, I'm not blaming the people down below. The man at the top's got to take the heat for all of it.
Nixon had very loyal men around him, folks who were willing to walk over broken glass. And he exploits that. Nixon exploits that, and he gets them to do his bidding.
Nixon had a tendency to surround himself with these young Southern California ad agency types.
The White House staff, as it evolves, I think you'll find will be smaller than it's been in the past. I know you'll find it'll be probably the youngest one in history, certainly one of the youngest.
Richard Nixon managed to charm them, and that charm was so strong that he pulled them over the line. He encouraged them to do things that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise done.
And they seemed to be involved in one giant contest to prove to the boss who could be tougher, who could be more ruthless.
The critics call them the Germans and describe their office as the Berlin Wall. I'm speaking of President Nixon's chief White House advisors, John Ehrlichman, and HR for Harry Robbins Haldeman.
Haldeman and Ehrlichman were like brothers to Nixon at times. I mean, they served in every possible personal and professional role for him.
Haldeman and Ehrlichman understood the importance of protecting the president.
I knew Haldeman to say hello to, although he was a much feared figure, and I remember my father used to call him the Jolly Steel Buzzsaw.
You want to understand Bob Haldeman? Look at his haircut.
Bob Haldeman was the chief of staff of the White House. And people said, whatever Haldeman knows, the president knows. In February of 1972, the election year, there was one reputable poll that said that one of his opponents within 1 point of beating him in an election. And clearly Mr. Nixon said, I'm going to make certain that my enemies don't get me.
The Nixon campaign's political propaganda arm publicly portrays two arch villains to the re-elect Nixon effort. the national media, which will slant stories unfavorable to the administration, and Democratic frontrunner George McGovern.
Operation Gemstone was a plan of dirty tricks and of political tactics leading up to the election year of 1972. Nixon would call it rock'em sock'em politics or hardball. It wasn't just tough politics. It was criminal behavior.
I said, well, if you're talking about an all-out, full offensive and defensive capability political intelligence operation, you're talking about one hell of a lot of money.
G. Gordon Liddy put together this madcap collection of crimes.
Each different kind of operation was given the name of a precious jewel. We had so many operations, we quickly ran out of precious jewels. We went into semi-precious jewels, and by the time we were finished, we were down to coal and brick.
Liddy, I say, was a cowboy. Liddy was a hotshot. Liddy was the guy who would do it and could do it.
When you hire a G. Gordon Liddy, you're hiring a guy that's going to do what he's told to do, and there's not a lot of boundaries.
We later learned that Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy plotted to try to kill Jack Anderson, the columnist.
Gordon Liddy brushed by me and he said, Jeb just told me to take care of Jack Anderson.
I said, I am to kill Jack Anderson. I am on my way to kill Jack Anderson. He said, oh my God. He took off like a deer running down the hall.
I then went into Magruder's office and I said, Jeb, did you just tell him to rub out Jack Anderson?
I said, Gordon, I was just talking off the cuff. I wasn't serious. And Liddy looked at me with that stern, sort of macho look, and he said, never give me an order for a hit job that you don't mean, because I'll do it.
The irony is that he had been an FBI officer. And yet, he comes out of the FBI environment and he is ready to break laws at the request of the executive.
Gordon Liddy goes to the Department of Justice, the highest law enforcement officer in the land. He's in the Attorney General's very formal office, and Gordon Liddy presents Operation Gemstone, under which they will not only break into the DNC offices in the Watergate complex, but they will hire a houseboat to place outside of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami during the Democratic Convention. They will put prostitutes on this houseboat with cameras, so they will lure Democratic delegates onto the houseboat and blackmail them.
John Mitchell, who was transitioning from the Department of Justice to the head of the Committee to Re-elect the President, was the man who was going to okay or not this collection of crimes.
They asked for $1 million, and John Mitchell didn't say, are you guys crazy? Get out of here. That's all illegal. That's crazy. No, he said, it's too expensive. Please come back with a lower budget.
There was pressure from the White House, from me, and from the President to the committee to get their campaign intelligence activity going.
To me, it was a throwaway project. Give Liddy the $250,000 and let's get him off our back and satisfy the White House. And Mitchell finally said, okay, let's go with it.
I remember at the beginning there was a sense of the mastermind of all of this is Gordon Liddy. Well, history now has established that the mastermind was Richard Nixon.
And so when we come to the Watergate story, it was perfectly in character. Even though he looked like he was set up for a pretty comfortable re-election campaign, it was perfectly in character for him to say, well, I want every advantage. I will approve this, I will approve that, because he thought if he played it straight, he might lose. And so he played it a little crooked.
I was called in by Judge Stuart Magruder to his office, and he said, can you get into the Watergate office building?
Over the weekend, 5 men were nabbed at the Democratic National Headquarters here in Washington, seemingly preparing to tap or bug the place.
Eventually, the United States Supreme Court would hear the court case of Nixon versus the U.S. In it, the court agreed unanimously that these tapes were not executive privilege because these tapes pertain to a criminal matter. And because they pertain to a criminal matter, they must be released. Eventually, the tapes were released, and in one of the tapes where Dean had said This is where the president had heard about Watergate, that Dean had stated there was a cancer on the presidency. The tape was played and there was nothing. A key section had been erased. Now, Mr. Nixon's private secretary said it was her bad that she had accidentally erased the tape in preparation for giving it to the Senate. But everybody knew that Nixon probably had something to do with it. By August of 1974, the U.S. House had impeachment proceedings going. Richard Nixon began to talk to the various senators and discovered that over 2/3 of them would vote to remove it. In August of 1974, Richard Nixon is going to invoke the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment allows a president to resign. Nixon said he was going to resign for medical reasons.
When President Nixon ran for re-election in 1972, his popularity was never higher. The most famous Cold Warrior of his era had earned acclaim for his diplomatic breakthroughs with China and the Soviet Union. Despite bitter controversy over his handling of the war in Vietnam, the polls showed Nixon easily defeating his Democratic challenger. But Nixon's political skills were no match for his paranoia. In hopes of gaining an upper hand, Nixon's underlings hatched a scheme to burglarize the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in June of 1972. When the burglars were arrested, Nixon approved a cover-up, which slowly but surely came unraveled.
Watergate, Senate hearings. To ensure complete live nationwide coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings, the 3 commercial television networks are rotating the daily coverage.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
By the spring of 1974, the Watergate affair was a full-blown scandal, as televised congressional hearings gradually uncovered the cover-up.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of the installation of any devices on any of the telephones, first of all, the Oval Office?
Yes, sir.
Now, the tapes which you mentioned, which are stored, are they stored by particular date?
Yes, sir, they are.
And so that if either Mr. Dean, Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Ehrlichman, Mr. Colson had particular meetings in the Oval Office with the President on any particular dates that had been testified before this committee, there would be a tape recording with the President of that full conversation, would there not?
Yes, sir.
Nixon claimed that the tapes were designed to secure his place in history. Instead, they sealed his fate. On August 8, 1974, Nixon delivered his farewell address to the nation.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shaped the history of this nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The next morning, Nixon made a final White House appearance.
Steve Bull came up to brief us on the entrance into the grand ballroom where we were to say goodbye to the official administration people, the cabinet, and all the other top people in administration, about 300 of them. Then he said, now the 3 television cameras will be here. And Mrs. Nixon said, not on your life. She said, after what they have done to us, I am not going to let them interfere in this last private meeting with our friends. Well, I had to disagree, and I said, no, we have to do it. We've got to do it for our friends. We've got to do it for the country.
Then at noon, August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon boarded a helicopter to make history one last time as the only U.S. president to resign his office. Back in 1952, Richard Nixon's checker speech harnessed the power of television to save his career. 22 years later, television was there to chronicle his political self-destruction.
The question was always, who exactly was Deep Throat? In 2008, dying of cancer, Mark Felt, who was the assistant director to the FBI, the number 2 man in the FBI, says yes, he was Deep Throat. Woodward said yes, Felt was Deep Throat. And that mystery has finally been solved.
We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
It starts the morning of the burglary. They called me in.
That call to Bob Woodward, who had been working at the Washington Post for only 9 months, set in motion the most incredible sequence of events in American political history.
I think the editors who were in looked around and said, who would be foolish enough to come in on Saturday? And they knew I would come in.
This looks like the very beginning. Mm-hmm. These are Woodward's notes from the arraignment of the burglars the morning they were arrested.
The raw material of Watergate, now in the care of Steve Milkey at the University of Texas.
You can see the first note he took, 5 men arrested. At Democratic National Headquarters with sophisticated photo equipment.
And the judge asked where the lead burglar, James McCord, had worked. And McCord went, and the judge said, speak up. And McCord went, CIA. And he said, speak up. And McCord finally said, CIA.
Security consultant in quotes, and then retired from government, CIA.
CIA. This is the moment when Watergate takes off.
Carl Bernstein, a street-savvy reporter who had worked in newspapers since he was 16, horned in